Senator Van Hollen.
Thank you, Senator Schatz, and good to see you again, Mr. Secretary. I do want to follow up here where we left off earlier in this morning's Senate Foreign Relations Committee hearing, and I did hear your exchange with Senator Murray, where you indicated that in the middle of a conflict, it would be difficult to reach any final conclusions about whether or not U.S. weapons were used in violation of international humanitarian law. I would just point out that there are many other conflicts where we are able to quickly make and do issue those kind of judgments. But what I don't think is complicated at all is if you look at the period of time from October 7th, the terrible Hamas October 7th attacks, to the present, I don't think it's complicated to conclude that the Netanyahu government has complied with international norms with respect to the delivery of humanitarian assistance along that continuum of time. Is it your testimony today that the Netanyahu government has complied with international norms when it comes to delivering humanitarian assistance to desperate people in Gaza since October 7th till today?
I think there's been a huge gap between stated intent and actual results, and that's a gap that we've been trying to close every single day. And I think that's what we've been seeing for many months.
Mr. Secretary, I get that. Obviously my question was whether or not there's been a violation of international norms, which I think to any person with eyes to see and ears to hear, there have been. And as you know, there are many people in the U.S. government who have reached similar conclusions, and actually it's been well reported on. So I think that does hurt our credibility when we're not able to make that clear call. Let me move on to the issue where we were in agreement, I think, this morning, which is that it's in our national security interest to have a durable end to the conflict in Gaza and to the larger Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and that we can only achieve security and self-determination and dignity and justice for Israelis and Palestinians alike by securing a normalization of relations with Israel and Saudi Arabia and other states, as well as a clear plan, I think you said time-bound plan, to establish a Palestinian state. Am I paraphrasing that fairly?
That's correct.
And you agree that it's not possible to achieve a secure and just end to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict by jumping over the equities of the Palestinian people. Is that right?
Absolutely not. That's impossible. It would be self-defeating.
I want to emphasize that point because you know, Mr. Secretary, you've been around Washington for a long time, because it has been fashionable in some foreign policy circles to believe that you could do that you could somehow achieve peace and stability and security by jumping over the Palestinian issue. And I want to emphasize this because you have said that the Saudis are insistent on a clear path to a Palestinian state and time-bound path, but it's also in our national security interest. So are we also insistent on that?
Yes, we are. And again, it's interesting and I think instructive to note that perhaps the two most vicious and vociferous enemies of a two-state solution are Hamas and Iran. That should tell you something, and it also should tell you what a rebuke to both Hamas and Iran it would be if we could finally get on this pathway in a credible and time-bound way. And I think certainly everything we've heard from the Saudis in the context of having these normalization discussions makes it clear that they feel the same way.
Well, I'm glad you raised that because there is one other party, right, in addition to the two that you mentioned, that has been dead set against a Palestinian state and a two-state solution. In December of 2022, just the day before the new Netanyahu government was sworn in, Netanyahu issued a list of priorities for this new, very extreme government. And I'm quoting one of his guiding principles was, the Jewish people have an exclusive and inalienable right to all parts of the land of Israel, meaning including all the West Bank. So I want to read to you something else that now Prime Minister Netanyahu said back in 2019 at a Likud meeting, and this has been well reported, and I quote, "Anyone who wants to prevent the creation of a Palestinian state needs to support strengthening Hamas. This is part of our strategy to divide the Palestinians between those in Gaza and those in Judea and Samaria, end quote. So, Mr. Secretary, you mentioned some of the other opponents of a two-state solution. And it's absolutely true that Hamas believes in one state, right? Their despicable endgame is one state where they wipe out the state of Israel, right? And so can you be really clear as to why Prime Minister Netanyahu is simply misrepresenting the case when he says that a Palestinian state and a two-state solution would be, quote, a reward for Hamas? Isn't it exactly the opposite?
I believe it's exactly the opposite. Now, of course, a Palestinian state has to come with the necessary security guarantees for Israel. No one wants to see a state emerge that would become a threat to Israel. And I think there are effective ways to make sure that that doesn't happen. But yes, to your point, again, I think the biggest rebuke to Hamas and to Iran would be the realization of a Palestinian state alongside a Jewish and democratic Israel.
And I agree with you 100%, Mr. Secretary. I just want us to be clear-eyed about all the forces that are arrayed against us. Part of the effort to undermine the PA, or the two-state solution, has been undermining the Palestinian Authority. As you know, Finance Minister Smotrich has been withholding funds for the PA, which is weakening the PA and creating an even more unstable security situation on the West Bank. Today, Ben-Gvir talked about reoccupying Gaza. He said he'd like to live in Gaza. So this is today reported. So my question, Mr. Secretary, is what are we willing to do when people like Finance Minister Smotrich hold up funds for the PA, weakening security? And at what point do we say that our continued support is contingent on more cooperation?
I think if you ask the Israeli security forces, whether it's the intelligence forces, Shin Bet, whether it's the IDF, they will tell you that the PA plays an absolutely critical, essential role in trying to preserve security and stability in the West Bank. They do it in an incredibly difficult environment precisely because they're constantly being starved for funds. They're doing work that's actually vital to Israel's security. And so it's manifestly against the interests of Israel, and it's against our own interests to see the PA undermined in the fashion that some are attempting to undermine it. Second, in terms of governance going forward, it's imperative that not only the conflict in Gaza end as soon as possible, but that Israel come forward with a clear plan for how Gaza is going to be governed, secured, redeveloped, because the trajectory we're on right now, in the absence of such a plan, is either Israel stays and occupies Gaza, which is unacceptable to us and should be unacceptable to them because they'll be inheriting an insurgency that will bleed them for a long time. Or if they're not going to do it, then Hamas will come back, and we've seen already in areas that have been cleared, in quotation marks, by Israel, the return in some cases of Hamas. Or you'll simply have anarchy, lawlessness, which we see in most parts of Gaza right now. And that eventually will be filled almost certainly by something bad, even worse than the lawlessness. So there's an absolute imperative for that. We believe strongly that, of course, Palestinians must be governing themselves, whether it's in Gaza, whether it's the West Bank, and whether it's ultimately, of course, in a Palestinian state. And right now, for all of its deficiencies and challenges, the Palestinian Authority is the best vehicle for that. They have a new prime minister. They have a new government. They have a reform plan which needs to be implemented. In our own engagements with the prime minister, he struck us as someone who is serious and focused on actually trying to reform the PA so it's responsive to the needs of people and that it roots out corruption. But of course, if it has no resources to work with, it's going to be impossible to do the job. So we are at this constantly, including trying to make sure that the revenues that the PA is entitled to actually get to the PA.
Thank you, and I do think this is sort of the last gasp the coming year for a two-state solution, and it's going to require strong U.S. leadership. Thank you. Thank you, Senator.